Hello and welcome to Workload Identity Federation. This video, we're going to be talking about what Workload Identity Federation is. So if you've used it before, let us know your thoughts and comments about it in the comment section. If you haven't, then this video is for you. So let's get into it. In this video, you're going to learn a couple of things. First, starting with what Workload Identity Federation is. Then we're going to look at how we can set up Workload Identity Federation on GCP. And then lastly, we're going to have a live example and see how we can use Workload Identity Federation with a GitHub Actions workflow. So we're going to set up a workflow that connects to GCP and read some GCP resources, just to drive home the concept a bit. So what is Workload Identity Federation? In simple terms, Workload Identity Federation is keyless authentication for service accounts. So this means you do not have to manage service account keys anymore to connect to your workloads that are on third-party clouds, maybe AWS or maybe Microsoft Azure, to GCP resources. You can simply set up Workload Identity Federation and you do not need to manage service account tokens anymore. And this provides a lot of benefits. First of all, is the storage of access keys. GCP manages the storage and the distribution or issuance of access tokens, short-lived access tokens, for our workloads. So when your workload needs to connect or read resources on GCP, you do not need to provide a service account token anymore. I'm sure you're excited about this if you haven't used this before. Managing service account tokens can be a real pain. You need to set up these service account keys, download them, sometimes store them alongside your application, and manage them on an application by application basis, which can become very cumbersome. And then rotation as well. You need to rotate these keys as well because you don't want to have the same keys for a long period of time because it's a security risk to your application. If someone gets access to those keys, then they can make requests to your GCP infrastructure as you, and basically they can read any resources that those service account keys has access to. So what problem does Workload Identity Federation solve? If we haven't answered that already, in simple terms, it is the secret key management problem. So you do not have to manage secret service account keys or tokens anymore with your application. You do not have to think about service account keys rotation anymore. You just need to use Workload Identity Federation. Something else it does for you is it sets up identity provider verification. So where can you use Workload Identity Federation? Basically any provider that supports OpenID Connect. Now OpenID Connect is an additional security link that helps or enables client applications to validate that end users are exactly who they say they are based on verification credentials provided by a third-party authorization service. And so you can use Workload Identity Federation with workloads running on AWS, Microsoft Azure, Okta, even Kubernetes clusters. You can set up Kubernetes clusters as identity providers on GCP Workload Identity Federation. Now, let's take a look at how Workload Identity Federation works. First, you have a third-party application running on some cloud, maybe AWS, maybe Microsoft Azure, for example. And then your application is going to connect to your third-party identity provider. In this case, or in the example, we're going to be looking at our third-party identity provider is going to be GitHub. But as long as your identity provider or your third-party cloud supports OpenID, then you have an identity provider most likely. So your application connects to your third-party identity provider and retrieves what's called an OIDC token, OpenID token. Then your application uses that OpenID token to connect to Google Cloud. The Google Cloud Security Service issues what's called a federated token to your third-party application after it verifies your identity using the OpenID token that you provided. Now, your application can now use that federated token to request for a short-lived IAM token. So the short token is a token you can use to access Google Cloud resources by impersonation, say impersonating the service accounts that you provide or set up on GCP. And finally, you can use that short-lived token to access GCP APIs or resources that are running on Google Cloud. Basically, any resource that that service account that you're impersonating has access to. And how you set all of this up is by creating a workload identity pool on GCP and setting IAM permissions that you want that third-party workload to have access to. So basically any access you provide on GCP for that service account, you can provide that to your third-party application. Now let's take a look at how all of this work in action on GCP. So to set up our Workload Identity Federation connection, we're going to be using this GitHub repository. Basically, all you need is a GitHub repository that has some GitHub Actions workflow that we can use to connect to GCP Workload Identity Federation. And in my case, I have a GitHub repository here. I'll provide a link to this in the description so you can use it as well. Just clone this repository and make sure you have it locally. Okay, so what we want to do is set up a GitHub Actions workflow that runs from this repository and can connect to a GCP infrastructure. So here I will set up a GCP project right now on my organization. So if you have a GCP project already, then you should be good to go. So for me, I'm just going to create a new project. Okay. And I'm just going to call this project Workload Identity Test. And building account, organization, all of that is set, and I'll just create the project. Now that should go ahead and create the project for me. So now our project is created, we can switch to that project. So Workload Identity Test project. Okay. Now the first thing you want to do to use Workload Identity Federation is to go to the menu here, go under IAM and select Workload Identity Federation. There's a nice getting started workflow here, so I'm just going to click on get started. What it does is first enables the workload identity APIs on the project. Now once that's enabled, first thing here is we're going to create an identity pool. Now how workload identity works is it creates pools for identities. So pools are how you map external environments to GCP resources. So Google actually recommends that you create a workload identity pool for each external environment that you connect in to your GCP resource. So in our case, we're just going to call this dev GitHub Workload Identity Federation pool. Description, we're going to just call it dev environment GitHub Workload Identity pool, enabled pool. Yes, click on continue. Add a provider to pool. Okay, now it gets interesting. So we need a provider to connect to our workload identity pool. Now remember that the pool is how Google maps an external identity to your Google Cloud resources. Okay, so we're going to select a provider here and we're going to use the OpenID Connect. So if you're using AWS, then Google already has a pre-configured AWS provider here for you. You can just use to easily set up with custom configurations. But in our case, we do not have, so we'll select OpenID Connect. Now it requires us to provide a provider name. So in our case, we're just going to call our provider dev GitHub Workload Identity Federation pool and a provider ID. So we're just going to set our provider ID to the same thing we set as a provider name. This is just a unique identifier for this provider we're setting up. So I'm just going to call it the same thing. Now the issuer URL. Okay, you may be wondering what this is. Now this is a value that you need to get from your identity provider. In our case, it's GitHub, and I already have the GitHub identity token issue URL, and that is this. And how do I know that that is the issue URL for the GitHub identity token? Is because when you look at the GitHub OpenID Connect documentation, you scroll all the way, you can see the issue URL is right here. Okay, all identity providers will usually give you an issue URL that you can use to set up your OpenID Connect. Okay, so I have that set up. Audiences. Now for the audience configuration, we're just going to leave that set to default, but you can actually customize the audience, and the audience field is something that's set in your OIDC token from your provider. So if you need to set up that custom configuration, go ahead and set allowed audiences and set those audiences from your identity provider. But in our case, we're just going to leave it at default audience. Click and continue. Now configure provider attributes. What are provider attributes? This is another name for what's called an assertion mapping. The OpenID token that's provided from third-party providers usually have certain fields in it. So usually Google supports the setting the subjects, setting the groups, and also setting custom attributes. Now, in our case, we want to map the subject. So the subject is what Google uses internally to identify the resource that's requesting access to GCP resources. Okay, so we want to map that subject to the field that's provided in our OpenID token called assertion.sub. Now, most OpenID tokens have the sub set in there, have the audience and a couple other fields. So this is how you tell GCP what fields in your OpenID token it should map to the corresponding GCP token keys. So we're saying Google subject should map to the assertion.sub. Now don't worry too much about this. I'll leave a link in the description so you can read more about assertion or claim mapping or attribute mapping and understand that much more. We just want to set up about 3 attribute mapping. So first, the Google subject, we want to map that to the assertion.sub. Want to add a couple other mappings. Want to add a custom mapping for our repository, okay, and want to map that to assertion.repository because I want to limit who can use this workload identity pool to the repository. So I don't just want anyone that has access to the service account and my provider ID to be able to use this. Okay, and you'll see that in a moment. And then I also want to create an attribute mapping for actor, and I want to map that to assertion.actor. Okay, so with these 3 attribute mapping provided, we can go ahead. Okay, so I'm just gonna click on save. This should create our workload identity federation pool. Okay, so now we have our pool created. The next thing we want to do is grant access by creating a service account that our external workloads can use to connect to this pool and access whatever resources we grant access to. Now, something important to take note here is this IAM principal. Now, that is the principal that we're going to be granting access to use the service account. So make sure you have that copied and stored somewhere. Okay, so just copy that and then go to grant access. Okay. Now we don't have a service account created yet, so we're going to click on create service account to create a new service account. And service account name, I'm just going to call it dev GitHub GCP resource access service account ID. You can call it whatever. I'm still going to call it the same thing. Okay, now service account description, I'm just going to call mine dev GitHub GCP resource access. Description doesn't really matter, just make sure it's something that's descriptive for you. Okay, so create and continue. Now that creates a service account. Now we're going to grant some access. Now I need this service account to be able to read compute resources. So I'm going to grant it the compute viewer access role. And then another role that's important is the workload identity user role. Okay, this is important because this uses a service account impersonation. So you need to grant us this so the principal can impersonate the service account. So continue. And then here, service account users role. This is where we use the principal that we copied from the previous section. Okay, so just paste that in there and click on done. And with that, our service account is all set. Okay, so if we go back to Workload Identity Federation and go back to our pool that we just created, and we click on connected service accounts, and we don't have a service account connected yet. That's what it's saying. But now we can click on grant access and select the service account that we just created. Okay, now something else we can do is to either grant access to all identities in the pool or limit the access to all the identities that match specific filters. Now in my case, I want to limit the access to just identities that match specific filters, which is why I created custom attributes or assertion mappings when I was creating the workload identity pool, if you remember. So I'm going to select only identities matching and I'm going to set repository. Okay, I want this identity, I only want to allow identities where the subject matches my GitHub repository. Okay, so I'm going to paste in the GitHub repository value in this format. Okay, so I want access to be granted to only identities where the repository matches this, which is my GitHub repository, and the branch comes from my main branch. Now this format may look a bit weird to you, but if you read the documentation, you'll understand why it's set in this format. Okay, so save. Now we can download our configuration, but we really don't need this. So if you want to go ahead, if you're building an application from scratch that you want to connect to GCP using Workload Identity Federation, now this file doesn't contain any sensitive information, so it's something you can store anywhere in code, but we don't need this in our use case, so we're just going to dismiss that. Okay, so now we have our Workload Identity Federation set up. So now back in the code, I have my repository set up. I have a basic GitHub Actions workflow. All it does is just connect to GCP using Workload Identity Federation. And I'm using the Google GitHub Actions action, which is called Google GitHub Actions. Now all this action does, it provides you with a way to connect to Google Cloud from GitHub Actions. And it supports Workload Identity Federation. So I'm going to leave a link here as well. You can go check this out. It's very simple. Just call the GitHub Actions and provide your workload identity provider in this format, pool provider, and also provide the service account as well that you created and you want to use to connect. So we're just going to do that as well. That's GCP project. That's what we're going to call this. Okay. GCP project ID, and we're setting a zone that we want to read resources from. Okay, and then we're setting permissions as well. This just sets what permissions your GitHub Actions workflow is allowed to use. This is needed to be able to check out and read contents from the repository, and this is needed to be able to write the ID token that's used for workload identity. So here we're setting up the GitHub Actions. We're saying token, and here we're reading the workload identity provider ID from a GitHub Action secret. And then we're setting our service account also to GCP service account. Now let's set up all the secrets in our GitHub repository. So we're going to head back to GitHub repository, go to settings, under actions, secrets and variables, actions. Now this is where you set all the secrets that you want to use for your GitHub Actions workflow. Okay, so now GCP service account, here I already have this set up. I'm just going to change the value to what we just created just now. So back on GCP, I'm just going to go to service account and get the service account that we just created. Okay, so copy that service account and then go back here, paste in the service account that we just created. It's going to take out an additional space, update that secret. Okay. Now, when you have that updated, then you want to set the workload identity provider as well. So workload identity provider ID, this is where you set the provider ID that you get from GCP. So if you go to Workload Identity Federation, select the pool, you have your principal in here. And how you set that is by copying just this format from projects, this. So I'm going to copy that. So here we provide the workload identity provider ID. And now there's a format you need to provide it as. So if we take a look at the configuration, you can see it's projects, your project number, locations, global, and all of that. /providers and the name of your provider. Okay. So in our case, we have the same format and name of our provider here as well. So update secret. Now that's set up. One more thing we want to add is our GCP project ID, which is something we need in our GitHub Actions workflow. So GCP project ID, and we're just going to go back to GCP and copy our project ID, which is what we have in it. So project ID, copy, and we're just going to paste that in. So now we have our project ID copied and set up, add secret, and with all of this set up, we should be good. So back in our GitHub Actions workflow, we have our project ID set up, and we have the workload identity provider set up, and we have the GCP service account as well set up. Now, the only thing left is that we do not have any compute instances that we're trying to read. So just for the sake of this demo, let's create a new instance. We're just going to create like 2 VM instances just to validate that we can access and read those. So enable the compute engine API. Okay, so now we have our API enabled. We're just gonna create an instance, and I'm gonna call this instance 1 US Central 1 C. We're just gonna create a US Central 1 C, and we're just gonna select the most minimum CPU or machine type. So with that setup, that's kind of all we need really. Allow default access, I'll just create. We're gonna go ahead and create another instance while that's getting created. And we'll leave this as instance. Same configuration, is E2 micro. And the US Central 1C again. And create instance. So now we have our instances running. Our service account has the compute viewer access, and everything looks like it's good to go. So let's take this out for a spin. I'm just gonna give it to Git. So let's take this out for a spin. I'm gonna add all this change. Git status. Now I have the change in there, which is this new file we're adding. So we're gonna get git commit message, and I'm gonna set that to new GitHub Actions workflow. Okay, now we're gonna do a push. Origin main. All we expect is our GitHub Actions workflow to kick off and that workflow to run. So if we go back to Actions, we can see our new GitHub Actions workflow has kicked off. So click on that. And if we click on viewing the steps, we can see what's happening. If everything goes fine and good, we should be able to secure a token from GCP, exchange that token for a short-lived IAM token, which we can use to read instances on our GCP. Oops, so we got an error. When we try to connect, it says retry function failed at one attempt, failed to generate Google Cloud Federated token, error, invalid target, error description, the target service indicated by the audience parameter is invalid. So now for our workload identity provider, we need to make sure it's in the full format that's provided here. So starting with projects, project number, location, global workload identity provider, workload identity pools, the name of our pool, and then the name of the provider that we created. So it has to be in this format, otherwise your authentication to Google is going to fail. So update secrets, now we have the correct secret, and now we can run our workflow. So now just before we commit our code, we're just going to run through one more time and see if everything's correct. Now this should be GCP zones with an S. We can just take out the zones option completely. This should list all resources that we have in our project. So let's just take out the zones since we don't use them anywhere else, and just only have one zone anyway for the instances that we just created. Okay, so let's save that and do a git status. We have our change in there. We're just gonna add them all in, okay, and do a commit. I'm just gonna say updates. I'm just gonna call this GCP resource list workflow demo. Okay, and now we're gonna push. Now if everything works correctly, this should be able to read secrets and run our workflow just like we expected. Okay, our workflow has kicked off. I'm gonna click in that and see what's happening. Okay, it started. Authentication succeeded. Okay, so we're able to get credentials, and yes, everything works like expected. So list instances, we can see the list of our instances, which was pulled directly from our GCP instances which we created. So everything seems to be working. Our authentication is successful and we're able to read credentials. So that's how you set up Workload Identity Federation from GitHub Actions to GCP. I hope you found this video helpful. In an upcoming video, I'm gonna set this up for GKE and how we can read and apply Kubernetes changes to a GKE cluster using Workload Identity Federation, and we do not have to manage access keys in any way. Now, some people see this as a much more longer process than using service account keys, but it's much more secure. So it's a trade-off, I'll say. The trade-off for security. It's a bit much more complex, but then provides a higher sense of security. So let me know what you think about this. If you're going to use it, leave a comment, like this video if it's been helpful to you, and I'll see you in the next one.